Hey guys, it's a very rainy Friday evening. We're going to cover a little bit of shock at this point. All right, so the way that I usually try and break down shock, and the way that I think most people who have any sort of success with these types of questions does it, is you break it down based off from concepts as opposed to trying to memorize that big confusing chart with all the ups and downs. So we'll go ahead and start with hypovolemic shock. Now, when I talked with a surgery preceptor about this recently, basically what we would talk about with each of these shocks is what exactly is the problem. So, of course, with hypovolemic shock, the problem is that you have low volume. So, what does that mean? Well, what it means is that most of the rest of your body is going to actually be able to compensate for it. It's going to be able to actually try and do something that makes sense. Okay. So if you were low on volume and all of your vessels were still trying to move it around, then their vessel resistance would go up. You would squeeze that vessel. Okay. Um, what would happen to your venous side pressure? Well, your venous side pressure would end up going down, and what would happen to your cardiac index? Well, we know that our cardiac index and cardiac output, that's like a heart rate times stroke volume, or cardiac index is adjusted in order to take into account how big the person's body is. But these types of things are going to go down because you're trying to minimize the need in the rest of the body. Um, and so it'll accommodate for it in that way. Now, cardiogenic shock, of course, this is a problem in the heart. So, the main thing that people tend to get confused on with this one is what are your vessels going to do? Well, they're going to do the same thing that they did in hypovolemic shock because the vessels aren't the problem. The vessels are certainly able to accommodate for this by squeezing. But what happens to the venous side pressure and the pulmonary capillary wedge pressure, which especially the PCWP, this is a reflection of what's going on the left side of the heart. Well, those are going to be able to go up this time as opposed to in hypovolemic when those go down. And the last big one that I'm going to talk about is going to be distributive shock. And why do I hone in on distributive shock? Well, because this is where sepsis falls in. And sepsis is a pretty common shock one. So, what is our problem with sepsis? Well, it's that our body is sick. So, again, compared to what we've been talking about before with hypovolemic and cardiogenic, the systemic vascular resistance, it's not going to be able to compensate because our body is sick, to put it plainly. So, your systemic vascular resistance goes down, okay? And your pulmonary capillary wedge pressure goes down because the left side of your heart isn't going the way that it normally does. Now, one thing that kind of throws some people into a wrinkle if you think this way is, well, what's going on with my cardiac output? Well, my heart is part of my body, and if I'm septic, wouldn't my heart not be working so well? Well, yes and no. A lot of the times, what ends up happening in sepsis is you'll end up becoming massively tachycardic. Okay, we see this pretty often where you'll become really tachycardic and really like hypotensive. And because you become so tachycardic, like I was talking about before with our heart rate type stroke volume, accommodated for or adjusted rather for body size for cardiac index, it's going to actually go up in distributive shocks like sepsis because that's just part of the equation. All right, so if all you wanted to do was just hear a little bit more about shock, especially as it pertains to step two, although this is probably all pretty similar to step one material as well, you can go ahead and sign off. I'm going to talk about a couple of things now. One of the things that I wanted to talk about is the murmur noises with aortic stenosis. Now, I had talked a little bit before in a different clip about aortic stenosis versus aortic regurgitation, but we didn't really talk about what type of murmur noises are we actually hearing with aortic stenosis. And one of the things that gets me is what makes that different than all the other ones. So mitral regurgitation, we're thinking about a murmur that goes to the axilla, but for aortic stenosis, you're thinking more of a soft, singular S2, so the second heart sound, especially during inspiration. But it could also be described as a late peaking crescendo decrescendo systolic murmur. We already know about the pulses. So the reason why I wanted to talk about the pulses again is because if you go parvis et tardis, okay, then there's an S and an S, so two S's, and the soft and single S2. So there's a lot of S's in twos. The second heart sound, soft and single, and parvis and tardis. So all of that to say, if you can just at least compartmentalize that to aortic stenosis, you'll be able to better evaluate whether or not that's what you're talking about or whether or not it'll be a different answer choice. Okay, well, that's all I'm going to talk about for this video. Keep in mind that I will be posting some more.